At exactly 2:10 in the afternoon on December 5, 1945, 5 American military aircraft lifted off from a naval air station just north of Miami, Florida. Nothing about the flight seemed unusual. The war was over. World War II had officially ended only a few months earlier. Across America, millions of soldiers, sailors, and pilots were returning home. Factories that had once produced bombers and tanks were beginning to manufacture cars and refrigerators again. Families were rebuilding their lives after years of uncertainty, and the United States stood at the beginning of what many believed would be a new era of peace and prosperity. But peace did not mean the military could simply stop flying. Thousands of new pilots still needed training. Veterans had to maintain their skills. The Navy continued running routine exercises almost every day over the warm waters off Florida's Atlantic coast. For the instructors and students climbing into their aircraft that Wednesday afternoon, this was simply another training mission, one they expected to complete before dinner. None of the 14 men climbing aboard those airplanes had any reason to believe they were about to become part of one of America's greatest mysteries. Their assignment was straightforward: fly east over the Atlantic, practice bombing at a designated target, turn north, then fly southwest back to Florida. The entire exercise would take only a few hours. It had been flown countless times before. The pilots knew the route, the instructors knew the route, the Navy knew the route. If everything went according to plan, nobody would remember Flight 19. History would never record its name, but history often begins with ordinary days. The 5 aircraft climbed into the bright Florida sky in perfect formation. Below them stretched one of the busiest coastlines in America. Behind them lay the growing cities of South Florida. Ahead lay the Atlantic Ocean, a vast blue expanse that looked calm, familiar, and almost inviting. For experienced military aviators, flying over the ocean was nothing unusual, yet the Atlantic has a peculiar way of changing its personality. From above, water offers very few landmarks. There are no roads, no mountains, no buildings, no signs pointing home. Hour after hour, every direction can begin to look exactly the same. Even today, pilots treat long flights over open water with enormous respect. In 1945, before satellites, GPS, digital maps, or computerized navigation systems, that respect was even more necessary. A single mistake could become impossible to correct. For nearly 2 hours, everything appeared normal. The student pilots completed the bombing portion of their exercise. Their aircraft continued along the planned route. Radio operators on the ground expected the formation to turn and begin heading back toward Florida. Instead, a transmission arrived that immediately caught everyone's attention. The flight leader sounded confused. His voice was calm but uncertain. He reported that he could no longer determine his position. At first, no one panicked. Navigation problems occasionally happened. Controllers believed they could simply guide the aircraft home. Then another message arrived. This one was more troubling. The pilot reported that both of his compasses appeared to be malfunctioning. Moments later came another statement, one that has echoed through history ever since. He explained that nothing looked right anymore. The ocean itself seemed unfamiliar. Imagine hearing those words if you were sitting in the control tower. A military instructor, someone responsible for leading 4 other aircraft, was telling you he no longer recognized the world beneath him. Something had gone terribly wrong. As radio operators tried to understand the situation, the confusion only deepened. The students began questioning their instructor. Some believed they knew where they were. Others trusted the man leading the formation. Voices overlapped across the radio frequencies. Ground stations attempted to calculate the aircraft's location. Different naval facilities joined the conversation. Weather reports were checked, compass headings were suggested. Everyone worked desperately to solve what should have been a simple navigational problem. Yet with every passing minute, the situation became more dangerous. Fuel gauges steadily moved toward empty. The afternoon sun drifted lower toward the horizon. Winter daylight was disappearing. And somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, 5 aircraft carrying 14 men were flying farther and farther from certainty. Then, something even stranger happened. As darkness approached, radio transmissions became increasingly difficult to understand. Signals faded in and out. Static interrupted conversations. Sometimes the pilots could hear the ground, sometimes they couldn't. Sometimes different radio stations answered at once. The more everyone tried to help, the more confusing the situation seemed to become. Then, silence, no final distress call, no dramatic farewell, no confirmed location, only empty airwaves. The 5 aircraft had disappeared. If the story ended there, Flight 19 would already rank among the most tragic aviation accidents in American history. But that was only the beginning. The United States Navy immediately launched one of the largest rescue operations it had ever attempted. Ships changed course. Aircraft prepared for takeoff. Rescue crews rushed into the growing darkness. One of those rescue aircraft was a massive Martin PBM Mariner flying boat. It carried 13 highly trained crew members. Their mission was simple: find Flight 19, bring the missing men home. Instead, the rescue aircraft vanished as well. Within only a few hours, 27 American servicemen had disappeared. No survivors, no confirmed crash site, no floating aircraft, no bodies. Nothing. It was as though the ocean had swallowed both the missing bombers and the rescue plane without leaving a trace. The Navy searched relentlessly. Aircraft crisscrossed thousands of square miles of ocean. Ships combed the Atlantic. The search expanded day after day. Pilots scanned the waves. Sailors watched for oil slicks, life rafts, or floating debris. The operation became one of the largest search efforts in American naval history up to that time. Still, nothing. As days turned into weeks, hope slowly disappeared. Families waited for news that never came. Military investigators gathered radio transcripts. Pilots replayed every decision. Experts studied weather reports. Navigators examined maps. Everyone asked the same question: where had Flight 19 gone? That question refused to disappear. Years passed, then decades. Instead of fading from memory, the mystery only grew larger. Writers revisited the case. Journalists retold the story. Television documentaries introduced new audiences to the disappearance. Eventually, Flight 19 became something much bigger than a missing military training mission. It became the defining story behind one of the most famous legends in the modern world: the Bermuda Triangle, a place where, according to countless books, ships vanished without explanation. Aircraft disappeared into thin air. Compasses spun wildly. Time itself supposedly behaved differently. Some claimed the lost city of Atlantis lay beneath the waves, sending mysterious energy into the sky. Others blamed extraterrestrials. Some imagined portals to another dimension. By the 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle had become a global phenomenon. Millions of people believed something supernatural lurked between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. And at the center of almost every version of the legend stood Flight 19. But here's the fascinating contradiction. The more historians, aviation experts, meteorologists, and Navy investigators studied the disappearance, the less mysterious it often appeared. Many of the claims repeated in popular books turned out to be exaggerated. Some famous quotations had been shortened or taken out of context. Certain details changed with every retelling. A few events that supposedly happened never happened at all. The real story became buried beneath the legend. And yet, the real story may actually be even more compelling. Because it isn't simply about 5 airplanes that disappeared, it's about the enormous challenge of navigating an endless ocean before modern technology. It's about how a single wrong assumption can trigger a chain of irreversible decisions. It's about the pressure of leadership when every choice affects other lives. It's about the limits of human knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, it's about how ordinary tragedies sometimes evolve into extraordinary myths. The men aboard Flight 19 never intended to become legends. They were instructors, students, veterans, young servicemen carrying out another routine assignment in the closing months of an exhausting war. Their families expected them home that evening. Instead, their disappearance became one of the greatest aviation mysteries in American history. Nearly 80 years later, aircraft still fly safely over the same waters every day. Cruise ships cross them without incident. Military exercises continue. Modern satellites watch from space. Yet the questions raised on that December afternoon remain remarkably powerful. What really happened to Flight 19? Did the pilots become hopelessly lost? Did faulty instruments seal their fate? Did rapidly changing weather overwhelm experienced aviators? Or has the legend grown so large that it now hides the truth instead of revealing it? To answer those questions, we have to leave behind the mystery for a moment and return to America in 1945. A nation celebrating victory, a Navy unlike any the world had ever seen, a generation of young pilots learning to navigate by little more than a compass, a map, and the sun above an endless sea. Because long before the Bermuda Triangle became a household name, before books, documentaries, and theories about vanished airplanes, there was simply another ordinary Wednesday, and a routine training flight that should have returned home before sunset. If you had stood on the beaches of South Florida in the closing months of 1945, you would have witnessed a country caught between two very different worlds. Behind America lay the largest war in human history. Ahead lay a future nobody could yet fully imagine. Only a few months earlier, the skies above Europe and the Pacific had been filled with thousands of military aircraft flying dangerous combat missions. Young pilots barely out of high school crossed oceans, landed on aircraft carriers in rough seas, escorted bombers over enemy territory, and fought battles that decided the fate of nations. Now, the fighting had stopped. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan had surrendered in September after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Second World War was finally over. Across the United States, celebrations swept through cities large and small. Church bells rang. Factories sounded their whistles. Strangers hugged in the streets. Millions of servicemen prepared to return home. But peace did not arrive overnight. The American military had become an enormous machine unlike anything the country had ever built. During the war, the United States had produced more than 300,000 military aircraft, launched thousands of ships, and trained millions of men and women for military service. That machine could not simply stop. Aircraft still required maintenance. Pilots still needed training. New technology had to be tested. The Navy, Army Air Forces, and Marine Corps all understood that another conflict could someday emerge. If it did, they wanted experienced crews ready to respond immediately. So, while much of the country celebrated the end of war, military airfields across America remained as busy as ever. One of the busiest stood just outside Fort Lauderdale, Florida today. Fort Lauderdale is known for beaches, tourism, and luxury yachts. In 1945, it was something very different. Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale was one of the United States Navy's most important training centers for carrier aviation. During the war, thousands of naval aviators had learned to fly there before deploying across the Atlantic and Pacific. The location was almost perfect. Florida's warm climate allowed flying throughout the year. The nearby Atlantic Ocean provided enormous areas where pilots could practice navigation, bombing, torpedo attacks, and formation, flying without endangering cities below. The Bahamas lay only a short distance offshore, creating realistic navigation exercises that challenged even experienced crews. To the Navy, South Florida was more than a beautiful coastline. It was an outdoor classroom stretching hundreds of miles across open water. Every day followed a familiar rhythm. Before sunrise, mechanics inspected engines, fuel crews prepared aircraft. Instructors reviewed lesson plans, students studied maps and weather forecasts, radio operators checked communications equipment, pilots gathered around briefing tables where instructors explained the day's assignments. Some missions focused on carrier landings, others practiced aerial gunnery. Many emphasized navigation. At first glance, navigation sounds almost simple. Choose a destination. Follow a compass. Arrive where you intended. Modern travelers rarely think about it because satellites quietly solve the problem for us. A smartphone can determine your position within a few meters almost anywhere on Earth. In 1945, nothing like that existed. Pilots had only the tools they carried inside the cockpit: a magnetic compass, a clock, paper charts, a radio, and perhaps most importantly, their own judgment. One of the most common navigation techniques was known as dead reckoning. The name sounds dramatic, but the method was surprisingly straightforward. A pilot began from a known location. He selected a compass heading, estimated wind speed and direction, calculated how fast the aircraft was traveling, then used time to estimate where he should be. If the calculations were correct, the airplane would arrive exactly where expected. If one assumption proved wrong, even by a small amount, the error slowly grew larger with every passing mile. Imagine closing your eyes in a large parking lot. Someone points you in what you believe is a perfectly straight line. Now walk for 20 minutes. If you drift only slightly off course, you may end up hundreds of feet away from your intended destination. Over the Atlantic Ocean, where flights covered hundreds of miles, tiny errors became enormous ones. Wind could push aircraft sideways without pilots immediately realizing it. Cloud cover could hide the sun. Radio signals weakened with distance. The ocean offered almost no visual clues. Unlike flying over land, there were no highways, rivers, railroads, or cities to confirm your position. Only water, endless water. This challenge was especially deceptive around the Bahamas. From the air, the region appears almost dreamlike. Brilliant turquoise water stretches across shallow banks. Hundreds of islands scatter across the horizon. White sand reflects sunlight so brightly that it sometimes blends with clouds. On clear days, visibility seems almost unlimited. Yet this beauty hides remarkable complexity. Many islands resemble one another. Shallow sandbars appear and disappear beneath changing tides. Ocean colors shift dramatically depending on depth. Strong currents, especially the Gulf Stream, move relentlessly through the region. Weather can change surprisingly quickly. A pilot who became uncertain of his position might look down and see islands in every direction. The problem was that identifying which islands they were could become extraordinarily difficult. A single mistaken assumption could trigger a chain of increasingly dangerous decisions. Ironically, the better a pilot believed he understood his location, the harder it sometimes became to recognize his mistake. That possibility would prove devastating on December 5. The aircraft assigned to that afternoon's mission were among the most successful naval aircraft of World War II. The Grumman TBM Avenger. To modern eyes, the Avenger appears enormous for a single-engine airplane. Its broad wings stretched nearly 55 feet. Powered by a massive radial engine producing roughly 1,900 horsepower, it could carry torpedoes, bombs, rockets, or depth charges while still covering remarkable distances. 3 crew members normally occupied each aircraft during combat missions: a pilot, a radio operator, and a gunner. Throughout World War II, Avengers served across both the Atlantic and Pacific. They hunted submarines, attacked enemy shipping, supported amphibious landings, participated in some of the war's greatest naval battles. They earned a reputation for toughness. Many returned safely despite sustaining heavy damage. By late 1945, the Avenger had become one of the Navy's most trusted workhorses. The aircraft selected for Flight 19 had already seen years of service. Now, instead of fighting enemy fleets, they trained the next generation of naval aviators. Most of the student pilots assigned to Flight 19 were themselves veterans. This surprises many people. Popular retelling sometimes suggests they were inexperienced recruits. They were not. Several had flown operational missions during the war. Some had hundreds of flight hours. They understood the Atlantic. They understood military procedures. This was not a group of beginners making careless mistakes. That fact makes what happened even more unsettling. Leading the exercise was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. On paper, Taylor appeared exceptionally qualified. He had accumulated more than 2,500 hours of flight experience, an impressive total for the era. He had served extensively during World War II, flying combat missions throughout the Pacific. He survived battles that claimed the lives of many other aviators. His students respected his experience. The Navy trusted his judgment. Yet Taylor possessed one characteristic that later investigators examined very closely. He had a history of becoming geographically disoriented. On more than one previous occasion, he had mistaken his location while flying. In one incident, he reportedly became so confused that another pilot had to guide him safely back to base. These episodes did not necessarily mean Taylor was reckless or incompetent. Even excellent pilots occasionally become lost. Navigation over water challenged the very best aviators. Still, these earlier incidents would later raise difficult questions. Had similar confusion occurred again? Or had something genuinely unusual happened that afternoon? No one knew. Least of all Taylor himself. The training mission scheduled for December 5 carried an unremarkable name: Navigation Problem Number 1. It was one of the Navy's standard exercises. Students would depart Fort Lauderdale, fly east approximately 56 nautical miles to a practice bombing range known as Hens and Chicken Shoals, located near the Bahamas. There they would simulate bombing attacks. After completing the exercise, they would turn north for a prescribed distance. Finally, they would turn southwest and return directly to Fort Lauderdale. The route formed a rough triangle over the Atlantic. It was specifically designed to teach pilots how to navigate using headings, time, and compass readings rather than visible landmarks. Weather forecasts predicted generally favorable conditions. There were scattered rain showers in parts of the region, but nothing considered dangerous for military flight operations. Visibility remained acceptable. Winds were manageable. The mission proceeded as scheduled. Shortly after lunch, pilots gathered for the pre-flight briefing. Maps were unfolded, headings reviewed, fuel requirements confirmed, emergency procedures discussed. Mechanics completed final inspections. Engines roared to life one after another. To everyone watching from the ground, the afternoon looked completely ordinary. The students joked with one another. Crew chiefs exchanged routine instructions. Radio operators adjusted frequencies. The instructors had flown this exercise many times before. No newspaper reporters waited nearby. No photographers prepared for history. No families imagined this would become the last time they saw their sons, husbands, or brothers. Perhaps the most haunting part of the entire Flight 19 story is precisely how ordinary it began. History often tempts us to search for warning signs, some overlooked clue, some mysterious coincidence, some unmistakable indication that disaster was approaching. But there wasn't one. There was only another routine Wednesday, another scheduled training mission, another group of military aviators doing exactly what they had done countless times before. If you had asked anyone standing on the runway that afternoon whether something extraordinary was about to happen, they almost certainly would have smiled and shaken their heads. The airplanes would be back before sunset. The crews would file their reports. The instructors would critique the students' navigation. Tomorrow's training schedule would begin all over again. That was the expectation. Instead, within only a few hours, one routine exercise would evolve into the most famous disappearance in American aviation history. And it would all begin with something so ordinary that almost every pilot has experienced it at least once. A moment of uncertainty about exactly where they were. At 2:10 p.m. On Wednesday, December 5, 1945, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers rolled down the runway at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. One after another, their engines roared to life, propellers slicing through the warm Florida air as each aircraft lifted smoothly into the afternoon sky. From the ground, there was nothing remarkable about the departure. Training flights left this air station almost every day. Mechanics watched until the aircraft disappeared into the eastern horizon before returning to their work. Control tower operators shifted their attention to the next scheduled movements. The men in Flight 19 became little more than tiny silver dots against an endless blue sky. No one watching them leave imagined that it would be the last confirmed sighting of all 5 airplanes. The formation consisted of 5 Avengers. Leading them was Lieutenant Charles Sick Taylor. Following him were 4 aircraft flown by student pilots, many of whom were themselves experienced wartime aviators continuing their naval training. Together, the formation carried 14 men. Their assignment was navigation problem number 1. The route was familiar. The procedures were familiar. Even the weather appeared cooperative. As the aircraft headed east over the Atlantic, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The pilots reached the Hens and Chickens Shoals, a shallow bombing range northeast of the Bahamas. There they practiced simulated bombing runs against floating targets. The exercise was completed successfully. No emergencies, no mechanical failures, no unusual radio traffic. Had someone ended the mission at that moment, Flight 19 would have been remembered only as another routine day in naval aviation. Instead, sometime after completing the bombing exercise, something changed. The exact moment remains uncertain. Unlike modern aircraft, there were no flight data recorders, no cockpit voice recorders, no GPS tracks. The only clues come from scattered radio transmissions heard by multiple naval stations. Those transmissions paint a picture that becomes increasingly unsettling with every passing minute. Around 3:40 in the afternoon, radio operators heard Lieutenant Taylor report something unexpected. He was uncertain of his position. At first, this did not seem catastrophic. Pilots occasionally became temporarily unsure of their location. Controllers assumed they could quickly establish his position and guide the flight back to Florida. Then, Taylor reported something even more troubling. His compasses were not giving reliable readings. To a modern audience accustomed to digital navigation, a faulty compass may sound like a minor inconvenience. For pilots in 1945, it could become a life-threatening problem. The compass was the foundation of ocean navigation. Without confidence in the compass, every heading became questionable. Every estimate became uncertain. Every mile increased the possibility of error. Ground controllers immediately began asking questions. What could Taylor see? Were there islands below? Could he identify the coastline? Could he determine the position of the sun? The answers only deepened the mystery. Taylor believed he was somewhere above the Florida Keys. At first glance, that might not sound alarming. The Keys are still part of Florida. Surely he could simply turn north and reach the mainland. But there was one enormous problem. Many historians believe Taylor was not over the Florida Keys at all. He was actually east of Florida, over the Bahamas. That single mistake may have determined the fate of everyone in Flight 19. To understand why, imagine standing in the middle of a vast forest. You mistakenly believe you're standing on the eastern edge of the woods when you're actually on the western side. Someone tells you to walk west toward safety. Confident in your mistaken location, you instead walk farther east. Every step takes you deeper into danger. That appears to be exactly what happened over the Atlantic. Taylor looked down at the islands beneath him and concluded they were the Florida Keys. In reality, they were almost certainly islands in the Bahamas. Because he believed he was south of Florida instead of east of it, every decision that followed carried the formation farther away from home. His students slowly began realizing something wasn't right. Several radio operators later recalled hearing younger pilots respectfully question Taylor's judgment. One reportedly suggested they simply fly west. If they were indeed east of Florida, flying west would eventually bring them back to the American coastline. It was the safest option. But if Taylor truly believed they were over the Keys, flying west would send the formation farther into the Gulf of Mexico. As the instructor responsible for everyone's safety, he hesitated. His uncertainty became everyone else's uncertainty. Leadership in aviation carries enormous weight. Military training teaches crews to trust their leader. Questioning an instructor is never done lightly, especially in the middle of a developing emergency. The students faced an impossible situation. Their own instincts may have suggested one direction. Their commanding officer believed another. Which should they follow? No one wanted to make the wrong decision. On the ground, radio operators desperately tried to piece together the puzzle. Several different naval stations could hear portions of the conversation. Unfortunately, no single station heard every transmission clearly. Radio technology in 1945 had significant limitations. Signals faded with distance. Atmospheric conditions created interference. Multiple aircraft transmitting simultaneously produced confusion. Controllers repeatedly instructed Taylor to turn west. Again and again. West. If he flew west long enough, he would almost certainly reach Florida. But Taylor remained unconvinced. His own understanding of his position conflicted with the advice coming from the ground. Meanwhile, another invisible enemy continued working against the pilots. Time, every minute consumed fuel. The Avengers carried enough gasoline for several hours of flight, but no aircraft has unlimited endurance. The longer they searched for their position, the fewer options remained. Soon, another problem appeared. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Winter days are short. Darkness comes quickly. Finding landmarks becomes dramatically harder. Clouds become shadows. Shorelines disappear. The ocean turns into an endless sheet of black water. Night flying over open ocean without reliable navigation was one of the greatest fears of military pilots. Then, the weather began changing. Popular versions of the Bermuda Triangle story often describe perfectly calm skies suddenly turning violent. The historical evidence suggests something less dramatic but no less dangerous. Conditions gradually deteriorated. Rain showers moved through parts of the region. Visibility declined. Clouds increased. Winds strengthened. The sea below became rougher. None of these conditions alone would normally doom experienced aviators. Combined with navigational uncertainty, however, they became extremely dangerous. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle while someone slowly removes the pieces. The pilots could no longer confidently identify the islands below. The horizon became harder to distinguish. Compass uncertainty remained unresolved. Fuel continued disappearing. Radio communication became increasingly unreliable. Every solution seemed to create another question. As the afternoon progressed, Taylor attempted several different headings. He hoped changing course might reveal recognizable landmarks. Instead, each adjustment only increased uncertainty. At one point, it appears the formation may actually have turned in the correct direction. If so, they may have come surprisingly close to finding Florida. But without recognizing it, Taylor changed course again. Historians still debate exactly how close Flight 19 came to safety. Some believe only a few more minutes on the correct heading would have revealed the American coastline. Others argue the aircraft had already wandered too far east. Either way, the opportunity slipped away. One heartbreaking aspect of the radio transcripts is how composed many of the voices remained. This was not widespread panic. These were military professionals trying to solve an increasingly complicated problem. Controllers offered headings, pilots discussed possibilities, students asked questions. Everyone remained focused on finding home. Yet beneath that professionalism, tension steadily grew. Every pilot understood the mathematics. Fuel gauges never lie. Eventually, there would not be enough gasoline left to continue searching. One of the last coordinated plans involved keeping the formation together until the lead aircraft reached a critical fuel level. Only then would they attempt a controlled ditching. Landing a large aircraft on open water sounds simple. In reality, it is extraordinarily dangerous, especially after dark. Especially in rough seas, especially in heavy military aircraft, the Avenger was rugged. But it was not designed to survive repeated impacts with ocean waves. Pilots were trained in emergency water landings, yet survival depended heavily on sea conditions. Winter waves in the Atlantic could easily overturn an aircraft within moments. Even if the crews escaped, finding life rafts in darkness while strong currents carried them away would be incredibly difficult. The ocean below Flight 19 was becoming increasingly hostile. As evening approached, radio reception weakened further. Some stations could hear fragments of conversations, others heard nothing at all. Static, interrupted transmissions. Messages overlapped. Controllers strained to understand fading voices. One transmission suggested Taylor planned to continue flying until the first aircraft reached roughly 10 gallons of fuel. After that, the formation would descend together. Then came one of the final messages believed to have originated from Flight 19. The pilots acknowledged they would have to ditch unless land appeared soon. No one knows exactly what happened next. Perhaps the engines gradually fell silent one after another. Perhaps the aircraft struck the ocean within minutes of each other. Perhaps the formation separated in darkness. No eyewitness survived to tell the story. At approximately 7 p.m., the radios went quiet. Flight 19 had vanished. Inside the control tower, uncertainty quickly gave way to urgency. This was no longer a navigation problem. It was a search and rescue operation. The Navy immediately launched one of the largest rescue efforts in its history. Ships were redirected toward the estimated search area. Additional aircraft prepared for takeoff. Every available resource focused on locating the missing formation before the cold Atlantic claimed any survivors. Among the first aircraft dispatched was one of the largest flying boats in the Navy's inventory, the Martin PBM Mariner. Unlike the Avengers, the Mariner had been designed for long-range patrol and rescue operations. Its enormous fuel capacity allowed it to remain airborne for many hours. It carried advanced radio equipment, searchlights, medical supplies, and a crew of 13. If anyone could find Flight 19, it was this aircraft. Yet the Mariner carried a reputation of its own. Some crews privately called it the flying gas tank. The nickname reflected concerns about fuel vapor accumulating inside certain compartments. While many mariners served successfully throughout the war, the aircraft had experienced several catastrophic explosions. Still, there was no time to hesitate. Shortly after taking off into the evening darkness, the Mariner headed toward the last known position of Flight 19. Then, it disappeared too. For years, this second disappearance became one of the most mysterious parts of the Bermuda Triangle legend. How could a rescue aircraft simply vanish? The answer may actually be simpler than the legend suggests. A merchant ship sailing in the area later reported witnessing a sudden explosion in the night sky shortly after the Mariner departed. Crew members described seeing flames followed by burning fuel spreading across the ocean's surface. Investigators concluded that the rescue aircraft may have suffered an in-flight explosion, an accident unrelated to Flight 19 itself. No definitive wreckage was ever recovered, but many aviation historians consider this explanation highly plausible. Even so, to the public, the effect was astonishing. First, 5 aircraft disappeared. Then the rescue plane disappeared. 27 men were gone. The following morning, the search intensified on an unprecedented scale. More than 300 aircraft participated. Dozens of ships combed the Atlantic. Thousands of square miles of ocean were searched. Pilots scanned every wave. Sailors watched for oil slicks. Coast Guard crews searched beaches. Nothing. No floating wings. No life rafts. No bodies. No confirmed debris field. Only empty ocean stretching toward the horizon. The Navy had solved countless wartime mysteries across 2 oceans. This time, the sea refused to give up its answers. And as the days turned into weeks, a simple training accident slowly transformed into something much larger, a mystery that would capture the imagination of the entire world for generations to come. When the search was finally called off, the Atlantic Ocean looked exactly as it had before Flight 19 disappeared. The waves continued rolling toward Florida's beaches. Fishing boats left their harbors before sunrise. Cargo ships crossed the same waters carrying goods between continents. Military aircraft continued training above the Atlantic. To anyone passing through the region, there was nothing to suggest that 27 American servicemen had vanished there only days earlier. Yet for the families waiting at home, life had stopped. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children all hoped that somehow, somewhere, a miracle had occurred. Perhaps the aircraft had landed on a remote island. Perhaps the crews had been rescued by a passing ship whose radio had failed. Perhaps they would walk through the front door days later with an unbelievable story. As each day passed, those hopes slowly disappeared. The Navy's search had covered an enormous area. Hundreds of aircraft flew systematic patterns across thousands of square miles. Ships searched day and night. Experienced pilots scanned the ocean for the smallest hint of floating wreckage. If even a single life raft had been spotted, rescuers would have rushed toward it. Nothing appeared. It was as though the Atlantic had erased every trace. The United States Navy now faced another responsibility. It had to determine what had happened, not to satisfy public curiosity, but to understand whether something had gone wrong that could endanger future crews. Investigators immediately gathered every available piece of evidence: radio logs, weather reports, maintenance records, flight plans, witness statements, accounts from radio operators, reports from pilots who had flown nearby. Unlike the dramatic investigations often portrayed in movies, most of this work happened quietly inside offices filled with paperwork, charts, and long discussions. There were no black boxes to recover. Modern airliners continuously record hundreds of flight parameters. In 1945, those technologies did not exist. Everything depended on human memory and handwritten records. Investigators replayed the radio transmissions again and again. Each message became another piece of a complicated puzzle. What heading had Taylor believed he was flying? When had he first become uncertain? Why hadn't the students simply turned west? Why had radio communication become so inconsistent? Could the weather have been worse than reported? Could the compasses actually have failed? Every answer seemed to create two new questions. The first Navy investigation reached what many historians consider the most likely conclusion. Lieutenant Charles Taylor had become disoriented. Believing he was over the Florida Keys instead of the Bahamas, he unknowingly led the formation farther out into the Atlantic. Eventually, the aircraft exhausted their fuel and were forced to ditch in rough seas after dark. It was a tragic chain of human errors compounded by difficult conditions. Yet that conclusion created another problem. Taylor was no longer alive to defend himself. His mother strongly objected to an official report that appeared to place responsibility on her son. She argued that without knowing exactly what happened, investigators could not fairly blame him. Her concerns reached Navy officials. Eventually, the investigation's wording was changed. Instead of assigning responsibility directly to Taylor, the official cause became something far more mysterious: cause unknown. Those two words would have consequences far beyond anyone's imagination. At the time, they were meant as an acknowledgement of uncertainty. Instead, they became fertile ground for speculation. People dislike unanswered questions. An unsolved mystery has a peculiar effect on the human mind. When evidence is incomplete, imagination often fills the empty spaces. Throughout history, this has happened repeatedly. Ancient civilizations created myths to explain eclipses. Sailors imagined sea monsters lurking beyond the horizon. Lost colonies inspired tales of hidden kingdoms. The disappearance of Flight 19 arrived at precisely the right moment for another modern legend to begin. The late 1940s and 1950s were decades fascinated by mystery. Flying saucer reports captured newspaper headlines. The Cold War encouraged secrecy. Nuclear weapons made the world seem both technologically advanced and strangely uncertain. Science fiction became enormously popular. Television brought extraordinary stories into millions of homes. People were increasingly willing to believe that the world still contained places beyond ordinary explanation. Flight 19 fit perfectly into that cultural atmosphere. At first, newspaper coverage remained relatively restrained. Most journalists focused on the tragedy itself: missing military aircraft, large search operation, families waiting for answers. But as years passed without discoveries, the story gradually changed. Writers began emphasizing the disappearance rather than the investigation. Certain details became simplified, others became exaggerated. Some quietly disappeared altogether. The phrase "without a trace" became one of the most repeated descriptions of Flight 19. Technically, that was largely true. No confirmed wreckage had been recovered. Yet the phrase also created an emotional impression that something impossible had occurred. Readers naturally asked themselves, how can 5 large airplanes simply vanish? The Atlantic Ocean, however, is unimaginably vast. Many people underestimate just how enormous it truly is. Imagine dropping a coin into a football stadium filled with water thousands of feet deep. Now imagine trying to find it weeks later while powerful currents constantly move everything beneath the surface. Recovering wreckage from the open ocean has always been extraordinarily difficult. Even today, with satellites, sonar, underwater drones, and advanced mapping technology, locating aircraft lost at sea can require years. In 1945, those tools did not exist. If the Avengers had broken apart during emergency landings, the Gulf Stream could have carried lighter debris far from the crash site within hours. Heavier wreckage would have sunk rapidly into deep water. The Atlantic often keeps its secrets, but mystery sells. And during the 1960s, one writer unknowingly transformed Flight 19 from a tragic naval accident into a global legend. His name was Vincent Gaddis. In 1964, Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine titled "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle," although strange disappearances had occasionally been linked together before. Gaddis gave the region something it had never possessed: a memorable name, the Bermuda Triangle. The phrase was brilliant, simple, mysterious, easy to remember. Instead of isolated incidents occurring across different decades, readers now imagined a single haunted region stretching roughly between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Flight 19 became the centerpiece of this new narrative. It offered everything a compelling mystery required: experienced military pilots, multiple aircraft, confusing radio messages, no confirmed wreckage, a rescue plane that also disappeared. It almost seemed designed for storytelling. Over the following decade, the legend expanded dramatically. Then came the book that introduced the Bermuda Triangle to millions around the world. In 1974, author Charles Berlitz published The Bermuda Triangle. The book became an international bestseller. For countless readers, this was their first introduction to Flight 19. Berlitz was an engaging storyteller. He collected disappearances, unusual events, historical anecdotes, and unexplained reports into a single dramatic narrative. The result was captivating. Unfortunately, many historians later concluded that it was not always accurate. Some radio conversations were shortened, others were paraphrased in ways that increased the mystery. Important context disappeared. Certain details were presented as established fact, even though evidence remained uncertain. For example, one of the most famous quotations associated with Flight 19 is, "Everything looks strange." Another often repeated line claims the pilot said, "Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." Those phrases have appeared in countless documentaries, books, and television programs, while they are based on contemporary reports. Historians continue debating exactly how they were originally transmitted and whether later retellings altered their wording. Like many legends, the story evolved every time it was told. Soon, ordinary explanations no longer seemed exciting enough. If airplanes could disappear without obvious evidence, perhaps something extraordinary was responsible. Speculation exploded. Some writers blamed magnetic anomalies. According to this idea, compasses inside the Bermuda Triangle behaved unpredictably because of unusual magnetic forces beneath the ocean. In reality, Earth's magnetic field does vary slightly from place to place, and navigators have long accounted for magnetic variation. Nothing about the region's magnetism has ever been shown to cause aircraft to vanish. Others proposed methane gas erupting from the ocean floor. The theory suggested enormous bubbles could reduce water density enough to sink ships while simultaneously disrupting aircraft engines. Although methane hydrates exist in certain parts of the world's oceans, no evidence links them to the disappearance of Flight 19. Then came one of the most imaginative ideas of all. Atlantis, some authors claim the legendary lost civilization rested beneath the Bahamas, where mysterious crystals supposedly emitted powerful energy capable of disabling aircraft and ships. No archaeological evidence supports this claim, yet the story proved irresistible. Lost civilizations have fascinated humanity for centuries. Combining Atlantis with missing airplanes created a mystery almost impossible to ignore. Others went even further. Perhaps extraterrestrials had abducted the crews. Perhaps invisible portals connected different dimensions. Perhaps time itself behaved differently inside the triangle. The more extraordinary the theory became, the more attention it attracted. Television embraced the phenomenon. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, documentaries, talk shows, and magazine programs repeatedly featured the Bermuda Triangle. Dramatic music played beneath ominous narration. Maps highlighted the triangular region. Illustrations showed aircraft disappearing into swirling clouds. Many productions blurred the line between documented history and speculation. To audiences, the distinction often became unclear. Flight 19 gradually transformed from a historical event into modern folklore. Yet while popular culture embraced mystery, another group of people continued asking quieter questions. Aviation historians, meteorologists, former naval pilots, oceanographers, professional investigators. Instead of asking whether supernatural forces existed, they asked something much simpler. Could ordinary circumstances explain an extraordinary outcome? Their research produced a fascinating picture. The Bahamas really are confusing from the air. Compasses can become difficult to interpret if pilots already doubt their location. Weather over the Atlantic changes quickly. The Gulf Stream moves rapidly enough to scatter floating debris. Nightfall dramatically complicates emergency landings. None of these facts are mysterious, but together they can become deadly. One important misunderstanding also emerged. Many people assumed the Bermuda Triangle experienced far more disappearances than other parts of the world's oceans. Careful statistical studies have failed to support that claim. The region is one of the busiest maritime and aviation corridors on Earth. Thousands of ships and aircraft pass through it every year. With so much traffic, accidents naturally occur. When adjusted for the volume of travel, the area does not appear significantly more dangerous than many other heavily traveled parts of the world. That doesn't make Flight 19 any less tragic. If anything, it makes the story more human. Rather than supernatural forces, it reminds us of how quickly uncertainty can overwhelm even experienced professionals. One mistaken assumption, one navigational error, one delayed decision, one setting sun. History often turns on moments no larger than that. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the legend of the Bermuda Triangle eventually became so famous that it almost overshadowed the men themselves. Charles Taylor, George Devlin, Edward Powers, Forrest Gerber, Joseph Bosse, and the many others aboard the Avengers and the Martin Mariner. They were real people with families, ambitions, and futures that ended on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The legend made them symbols. History reminds us they were human. And as technology improved through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, investigators gained new tools to examine what really happened. Instead of asking what myths could explain Flight 19, they began asking what evidence could. For nearly 80 years, people have asked the same question: what really happened to Flight 19? It is a question that has inspired best-selling books, television specials, podcasts, documentaries, internet debates, and countless late-night conversations. Yet one surprising fact often gets overlooked. The mystery has never been ignored by experts. Long after newspaper headlines faded and the Bermuda Triangle became part of popular culture, aviation historians, oceanographers, former Navy pilots, meteorologists, and underwater explorers continued studying the disappearance, not because they expected to uncover evidence of something supernatural, but because every aviation mystery contains lessons. Every accident teaches future pilots. Every investigation improves safety, and every unanswered question encourages another generation to keep looking. Unlike investigators in 1945, modern researchers possess tools that Charles Taylor could never have imagined. Today, satellites monitor weather systems across the Atlantic in real time. Global Positioning System satellites can determine an aircraft's position within a few feet almost anywhere on Earth. Commercial aircraft constantly broadcast their location. Digital maps display coastlines, islands, and navigation routes with extraordinary precision. Radar networks track aircraft across enormous distances. Even the ocean floor has become increasingly well mapped through sonar technology. If Flight 19 disappeared today under identical circumstances, investigators would almost certainly know far more about its final moments. Yet despite all these advances, one uncomfortable truth remains: technology cannot recover evidence that was never found. No confirmed wreckage of the 5 Avengers has ever been identified. That single fact continues to fuel speculation. But historians often respond with another question: should we really expect the wreckage to have been found? To answer that, we first need to understand the Atlantic Ocean itself. When people imagine the ocean, they often picture a giant swimming pool with a relatively flat bottom. Reality is far different. The waters east of Florida change dramatically within surprisingly short distances. Near the Bahamas, shallow turquoise banks suddenly give way to deep underwater cliffs. Beyond those cliffs lies water thousands of feet deep. Some portions descend well beyond the height of the world's tallest skyscrapers. If an aircraft sinks into that environment, finding it becomes extraordinarily difficult, even today. Consider another famous aviation mystery. In 2009, Air France Flight 447 disappeared over the Atlantic while traveling from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Unlike Flight 19, investigators knew almost exactly where the aircraft had vanished. Modern satellites tracked its route. Automatic systems transmitted maintenance messages before impact. Even with that information, it took nearly 2 years and multiple international search operations before the main wreckage was finally located almost 13,000 feet beneath the surface. If recovering a modern airliner with sophisticated tracking technology required years of searching, imagine trying to locate 5 military aircraft that disappeared in 1945 with only approximate radio transmissions to estimate their location. The challenge becomes almost unimaginable. Then there is the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is one of the strongest ocean currents on Earth. Flowing northward along Florida's Atlantic coast, it carries enormous volumes of warm water toward the North Atlantic. The current moves surprisingly fast. Floating debris entering the Gulf Stream may travel dozens of miles in a single day. A life raft, a wing section, a fuel tank, all could be scattered across vast distances before search crews ever arrived. Meanwhile, heavier components would sink rapidly. The result is an investigator's nightmare. Even if debris initially floated after an emergency ditching, the ocean itself immediately began rearranging the evidence. Every passing hour reduced the chances of reconstructing what had happened. This helps explain why so little was ever recovered. Another important development has come from underwater archaeology. Over the past several decades, researchers exploring the waters around Florida have discovered numerous aircraft wrecks resting on the seabed. Many date from World War II. Others were training aircraft that crashed during routine exercises. Still others belong to civilian accidents spanning many decades. Florida's military history means thousands of aircraft once operated in the region. Accidents, though relatively rare, were inevitable. Some of these wrecks have sparked excitement. Every time divers locate another World War II aircraft, headlines occasionally suggest that Flight 19 may finally have been found. So far, none of those discoveries has been conclusively linked to the missing formation. Serial numbers often identify the wrecks as entirely different aircraft. Others are too damaged or incomplete to provide certainty. The ocean still guards many unanswered questions. While physical evidence remains scarce, historians have developed a much clearer understanding of the decisions made inside the cockpits. Perhaps the strongest explanation remains surprisingly simple. Lieutenant Charles Taylor became geographically disoriented. Disorientation is one of aviation's oldest and most dangerous hazards. It affects beginners. It affects experts. It affects military pilots and airline captains alike. Human beings naturally trust what they believe they see. But over featureless terrain or featureless ocean, our brains can become remarkably unreliable. Taylor almost certainly believed he was making logical decisions. If he truly thought the islands beneath him were the Florida Keys, then flying northeast or east at certain moments may have seemed reasonable. The tragedy was not irrational thinking. It was rational thinking based on an incorrect assumption. Once that assumption became firmly established, every new observation reinforced it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. People naturally interpret new information in ways that support what they already believe. It affects doctors, scientists, police investigators, military commanders. Pilots are not immune. Taylor interpreted the landscape through the belief that he was already southwest of Florida. His students interpreted the same landscape differently. Ground controllers using radio bearings and maps believed something else entirely. By the time everyone realized how serious the disagreement had become, valuable time had already disappeared. Fuel, unlike uncertainty, cannot be debated. Eventually, the aircraft had to descend. Most investigators now believe the Avengers likely exhausted their fuel somewhere east of Florida and were forced to ditch in increasingly rough seas after sunset. Even if one or more aircraft landed successfully, survival prospects remained poor. The TBM Avenger was not designed to float for long. Heavy waves could easily break the aircraft apart. Cold December water, darkness, strong currents, and limited rescue visibility created almost impossible conditions. The tragedy may have unfolded within minutes. What about the compasses? Many books portray both of Taylor's compasses as mysteriously failing at exactly the same time. Modern investigators approach that claim more cautiously. Could a compass malfunction? Absolutely. Magnetic compasses can become unreliable if damaged or improperly calibrated. But two completely independent compass failures are statistically less likely. Some historians suggest Taylor may have doubted perfectly functional instruments because their readings conflicted with where he believed he was. Imagine using a GPS that insists you are driving north while you're convinced you're traveling east. Which do you trust? Many people instinctively trust their own mental picture. That conflict between instruments and human perception may have played a crucial role. Weather has also received renewed attention. Contrary to some dramatic retellings, no massive supernatural storm suddenly engulfed Flight 19. However, weather reports confirm scattered rain showers, increasing winds, and deteriorating sea conditions during the late afternoon and evening. Those changes mattered enormously. Poor visibility makes identifying islands far more difficult. Clouds hide the sun. Rough seas complicate emergency landings. Darkness magnifies every problem. Again, none of these factors alone explains the disappearance. Together, they create a chain of events that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Then, there is the second mystery: the Martin PBM Mariner rescue aircraft. For decades, its disappearance strengthened public belief that something supernatural affected the region. After all, how could a rescue plane vanish while searching for another missing flight? Modern aviation historians increasingly view the Mariner as an entirely separate tragedy. The aircraft had a known reputation for fuel vapor explosions. Its large fuel tanks and ventilation system created hazards that maintenance crews monitored carefully. Shortly after the Mariner departed, a merchant ship reported witnessing a bright explosion followed by burning fuel spreading across the ocean. The timing matched the rescue aircraft's route remarkably well. Although investigators could never prove the connection beyond doubt, many now believe the Mariner exploded in mid-air due to an internal mechanical failure. If true, its disappearance had nothing to do with Flight 19. The two tragedies merely occurred on the same evening. History sometimes creates coincidences that appear connected when they are not. Perhaps the most fascinating development, however, has little to do with aviation. It concerns human psychology. Researchers studying the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon noticed something curious. Whenever an unexplained disappearance occurred inside the triangle, it received enormous publicity. When similar disappearances happened elsewhere, they attracted far less attention. Over time, this created a powerful illusion. People remembered the mysterious cases inside the triangle while forgetting equally mysterious accidents outside it. Psychologists call this selection bias. We notice information supporting an existing belief while overlooking information that challenges it. As a result, the Bermuda Triangle seemed uniquely dangerous, even though statistical analyses found no evidence that ships or aircraft disappeared there at unusually high rates. The region simply experiences enormous traffic. Commercial airliners, private aircraft, military flights, cruise ships, cargo vessels, fishing fleets, pleasure boats. With so many people traveling through the area every day, accidents are unfortunately inevitable. The U.S. Coast Guard has repeatedly stated that there is no scientific evidence identifying the Bermuda Triangle as a uniquely hazardous location. Lloyd's of London, one of the world's largest marine insurers, has reached similar conclusions over the years. Insurance companies, perhaps more than anyone else, rely on accurate risk calculations. If the triangle truly presented extraordinary danger, insurance premiums would reflect that reality. They generally do not. Yet, knowing this does not diminish the power of the legend. In fact, understanding why the legend exists may be even more fascinating than believing it. Flight 19 sits at the intersection of two very human impulses: our desire for answers and our love of mystery. Most people are uncomfortable with uncertainty. We prefer complete stories. Beginning, middle, end, the disappearance of Flight 19 refuses to provide that ending. There is no final eyewitness, no recovered cockpit, no definitive crash site, only probabilities. Evidence, reasoned conclusions. For many people, that feels unsatisfying. Mystery offers something certainty cannot. Possibility, as long as the wreckage remains undiscovered, every theory, however unlikely, retains a tiny space to exist. That is why the Bermuda Triangle continues appearing in novels, films, television series, and online discussions decades after the original event. The legend tells us something important, not about supernatural forces, but about ourselves. Human beings are storytellers. When evidence leaves gaps, we instinctively fill them, sometimes with logic, sometimes with imagination, often with both. Flight 19 reminds us that history is rarely as simple as either skeptics or believers would like. It was almost certainly not the result of alien visitors, underwater civilizations, or portals through time. But neither was it just another accident. It was a convergence of geography, technology, weather, leadership, psychology, and unfortunate timing. A series of small problems that gradually became one irreversible catastrophe. And perhaps that is why the story has endured, because beneath all the myths and speculation lies something profoundly human. A group of experienced men trying to find their way home. They never made it. But the questions they left behind continued to travel across generations, reminding us that some of history's greatest mysteries are not born from impossible events. They are born from ordinary events that happen just far enough beyond our reach to leave us wondering forever. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, Flight 19 was never supposed to become part of history. It wasn't carrying a famous general. It wasn't attempting a record-breaking flight. It wasn't testing revolutionary technology. It wasn't embarking on a dangerous wartime mission. It was simply another routine training exercise, the kind of flight that had been completed successfully countless times before. And perhaps that is what makes the story so unforgettable. History often teaches us to expect extraordinary events to change the world. We imagine revolutions beginning with dramatic speeches, wars beginning with a single gunshot, great discoveries emerging from bold expeditions. But sometimes history changes direction for a much quieter reason. Sometimes it begins with 5 airplanes flying into an ordinary afternoon. Nearly 80 years have passed since those Avengers lifted off from Fort Lauderdale. The air station itself has changed. The airplanes that once filled its runways are now museum pieces. The young servicemen who waited on the flight line that day have long since become part of history. Entire generations have lived and died without ever knowing a world where the Bermuda Triangle wasn't already a famous mystery. And yet the questions raised that afternoon still refuse to disappear. Not because the Atlantic is hiding supernatural secrets, but because uncertainty has a remarkable way of surviving. The ocean, after all, has always been history's greatest archive, and its greatest censor. For thousands of years, it has carried explorers to new continents while quietly keeping the stories of those who never returned. Ancient trading ships lie scattered across the Mediterranean. Spanish treasure fleets rest beneath Caribbean waters. Submarines from 2 world wars remain where they sank. Passenger ships, fishing boats, naval vessels, and aircraft all share the same silent resting place beneath the waves. The sea rarely explains itself. It simply remembers. Flight 19 became part of that long tradition, not because it vanished into another dimension, but because the Atlantic is vast enough to hide even the largest machines built by human hands. It is easy, from the comfort of the 21st century, to underestimate the challenges those pilots faced. Today, we carry navigation systems in our pockets. Our phones can tell us exactly where we are, how fast we are traveling, and the quickest route home. Commercial pilots receive weather updates almost instantly. Satellites watch storms forming thousands of miles away. Air traffic controllers can monitor aircraft across entire continents. Emergency locator beacons activate automatically after many modern crashes. The world has become remarkably difficult to get lost in. In 1945, it was a very different place. Crossing open water demanded constant concentration. Pilots calculated headings by hand. They estimated wind drift. They trusted magnetic compasses. They compared islands with paper maps. Every decision depended upon observation, experience, and judgment. Most days, those methods worked remarkably well. Occasionally, they did not. Flight 19 reminds us how thin the line between routine and disaster can be. No single catastrophic event doomed those aircraft. Instead, investigators believe a series of small problems gradually built upon one another. A mistaken assumption, uncertain navigation, conflicting interpretations, changing weather, fading daylight, declining fuel, weakening radio communication. Each challenge alone might have been manageable. Together, they became overwhelming. That pattern appears throughout history. Many disasters are not caused by one enormous mistake. They are caused by several ordinary problems arriving at exactly the wrong moment. There is another lesson hidden inside this story, one that extends far beyond aviation. Human beings do not simply remember history. We reshape it. Every generation retells old stories in new ways. Sometimes we simplify them. Sometimes we exaggerate them. Sometimes we remove uncomfortable details. Sometimes we add dramatic ones. The story of Flight 19 demonstrates this process almost perfectly. Within a few years, newspaper reports evolved into magazine features. Magazine features inspired best-selling books. Books inspired television documentaries. Documentaries inspired films. Films inspired internet discussions. With every retelling, the mystery grew. Radio conversations became shorter. Weather became more dramatic. Compasses became more mysterious. The Atlantic became more dangerous. Eventually, millions of people knew the legend. Far fewer knew the history. That transformation tells us something important about ourselves. Facts satisfy the mind. Mysteries capture the imagination. The Bermuda Triangle offered something irresistible, a place where ordinary rules seemed not to apply, a modern frontier in an age when much of the world had already been mapped. For centuries, humanity searched for unknown continents. By the 20th century, there were few blank spaces left on maps. The Bermuda Triangle became a different kind of unknown, not an unexplored place, an unexplained one. Perhaps that explains why the legend spread so quickly. It reminded people that mystery still existed, that even in an age of radar, jet engines, and atomic power, the world could still surprise us. But the deeper we investigate Flight 19, the more fascinating the real story becomes, because it isn't a story about supernatural forces. It's a story about people. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a decorated combat veteran trusted to lead young pilots safely home, the students who relied on his experience, the radio operators who desperately searched for the right words to guide them, the mechanics who watched the aircraft disappear into the distance without realizing they would never see them again, the rescue crews who climbed into another aircraft despite knowing darkness and rough seas lay ahead, the families who waited by telephones, who listened for footsteps at the front door, who refused to give up hope long after hope had become painfully unrealistic. These were not characters in a legend. They were husbands, sons, friends, brothers, Their disappearance became one of history's greatest mysteries. But before it became a mystery, it was a human tragedy. There is also something strangely humbling about Flight 19. It reminds us that nature does not need supernatural powers to command our respect. The Atlantic Ocean has challenged sailors and pilots for centuries. Long before the first airplane flew, countless ships disappeared into storms, currents, reefs, and darkness. Long after Flight 19, the ocean continued testing every generation that crossed it. Technology has made travel safer than ever before. Yet experienced pilots still study weather with care. Captains still respect changing seas. Navigators still understand that confidence must always be balanced by caution. The ocean rewards preparation. It punishes overconfidence. That lesson has never changed. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the Bermuda Triangle itself has become larger than Flight 19. Ask someone today what they know about the Triangle, and they might mention disappearing ships, ghost stories, UFOs, or time portals. Many have heard the legend. Far fewer know about the 5 Avengers that helped create it. History sometimes buries reality beneath mythology. Recovering that reality is important, not because myths are worthless. Stories have always helped people understand the world, but because real people deserve to be remembered for what actually happened to them. Will we ever know exactly where Flight 19 came to rest? Perhaps. Advances in underwater mapping continue every year. Autonomous underwater vehicles now explore ocean depths once considered unreachable. Artificial intelligence helps researchers analyze sonar images. New expeditions continue searching for long-lost wrecks across the Atlantic. It is entirely possible that one day, decades from now, divers or robotic explorers will identify one of the missing Avengers resting quietly beneath layers of sand and coral. If that happens, one of America's oldest aviation mysteries may finally gain new answers. Or perhaps not. The Atlantic has held its silence for nearly 8 decades. It may continue doing so for centuries more. And maybe that uncertainty is part of what keeps the story alive. Not every question receives a perfect answer. Not every mystery is solved. History is filled with unfinished chapters. Flight 19 is one of them. But unfinished does not mean unknowable. Over the course of this journey, the picture has become much clearer. We have seen a nation emerging from World War II, a Navy training the next generation of pilots, a routine navigation exercise over familiar waters, an experienced instructor who likely misidentified his location, students caught between obedience and instinct, weather slowly closing in, fuel slowly running out, a desperate rescue mission that suffered its own tragedy, and finally, a world searching for meaning in an event that seemed almost impossible to explain. The evidence points not toward magic, but toward the fragile nature of human decision-making, toward geography that can deceive even experienced eyes, toward technology that had limits, toward an ocean large enough to conceal its secrets. In many ways, that truth is more powerful than any legend, because it reminds us that history is shaped by ordinary people making difficult choices under extraordinary pressure. The men of Flight 19 were not searching for mystery. They were searching for home. That simple fact has echoed through the decades. Today, thousands of aircraft still cross the same skies above the Western Atlantic every single day. Passengers look out their windows at the brilliant blue water below, rarely giving it a second thought. Cargo ships continue following routes that have connected continents for centuries. The Gulf Stream still races northward. The islands of the Bahamas still shimmer beneath the tropical sun. The ocean appears as calm and familiar as it did on that December afternoon in 1945. Yet somewhere beneath those waters, hidden by time, distance, and shifting currents, the final moments of Flight 19 almost certainly remain. Not waiting for ghosts, not guarded by mythical civilizations, simply resting where history and nature left them. And perhaps that is the enduring legacy of Flight 19. It gave birth to one of the world's greatest modern legends. But behind every legend lies a real story, a story of courage, of uncertainty, of leadership, of human fallibility, and of 27 men whose ordinary training mission became extraordinary only because they never found their way home. The Bermuda Triangle may always inspire debate. Books will continue to be written, new theories will emerge. Future generations will wonder whether something impossible happened over the Atlantic. But when we look beyond the legend and listen carefully to the voices that still echo through those fading radio transmissions, we discover something far more meaningful. Not a tale about a cursed stretch of ocean, but a timeless reminder that history's greatest mysteries are often born not from the impossible, but from the unanswered